this all year long as I talked about how to cut the cost of growing corn, but that's really where we're at today. We've really got to start looking at different technologies. The costs of what we came to rely on as cheap fertilizer, those days look like they're long gone here in a new world that we're thrust into in this 2022. So I think this is the right approach here. We're going to use technology. That's what we've always done as farmers, as agronomists, use technology. And our focus really has to be efficiency, better uptake of the nutrients that we have in the ground. Yeah, this is what's driving it, isn't it? This increase in fertilizer costs. I did this chart back in November of 2021, and at that time you could see the amount of difference there was over the past year. 87% on diammonium phosphate, potash up over 129. These are too cheap today, quite frankly. That's the shocking thing, is we thought these costs were high. I know 32% today is up in the almost 200% range here in the eastern part of the United States. So farmers have been paying over $1,000 a ton for anhydrous. This is the new world we're thrust into here, with the world tensions, the supply chain issues, the cost of cost of energy here, and everything driving these issues. So we as growers got to look at different things in order to be able to afford to plant crops like corn, which are intensively needing nutrients, particularly nitrogen and other nutrients like phosphorus and potassium, in order to reach the yields that we're going to need. I've been telling growers this all season long, guys, it's still yield. I don't care how you slice the deck, what those costs look like. You can afford to plant these crops and make money, and it's in yield. Now, certainly the markets have responded price-wise. There's a lot of opportunity in the price we're getting for corn, soybeans, and other commodities today. I think there'll be even further opportunity. I saw just a recent article saying, is the world going to face severe food shortages in the coming years? That certainly is going to be a driver for price, but yield's going to be it. We've got to yield in order to afford these kind of inputs in these crops. So I had these questions. I think they're worth looking at real quickly here as we lead into this issue about starter fertilizer and technology. Should I plant a crop like corn in 2022 that is going to require a lot of inputs, particularly fertilizer, high cost fertilizers? Well, there's three things that growers need to, and this is true about any crop this year. Know what a thorough knowledge of the economic outlook. Corn prices are currently on the Chicago Board of Trade up in the 640, 630, 640 range. They're trending higher. They've got to go even higher if we're going to draw acres out of soybeans. The soybean crop in South America is in severe trouble. And of course, that's drawing the soybean prices higher and making them very competitive against corn. Know your cost of production. Here in North Carolina, that cost of production for an acre of corn is somewhere around $640. It could be much higher on some of these high input farms, running over $800, $850 an acre, compared to a price of soybean per acre, about $350, $380 to grow an acre of soybeans here this coming year. That's risk, isn't it? We're paying a lot of money for putting in that. You're putting at risk that money. So when you got competitive soybean prices and lower risk, well, certainly that's what's driving the trend towards soybeans here that we see in the Southeast. And I have just got back from Ohio talking to growers there. Similar sentiments among growers about whether to plant corn, soybeans, or other crops this coming year. It's still yield. If you can establish, what I tell everybody is establish a strike yield. What is the yield you have to achieve in order to plant that crop this year? You got to know that strike yield, and then you've got to do everything you can possibly do to meet that or exceed that strike yield in order to make sure you're in business at the end of this year. So that leads to this third question, which we're really going to explore a little more today. Can we decrease the cost without impacting yield potential? And I think this is what we've got to do. And this is what I say utilizing technology is our way forward in doing this. Remember, yield's still king. We can't do anything that seriously jeopardizes that. So whatever we do has to continue to perform as well as the material that we took out. In other words, just cutting nitrogen rates or taking out phosphorus, that ain't going to do it. That's cutting your throat to save your pocket. That's not going to work. So we're going to focus here today with this webinar. There's several ideas I've been passing around how to decrease costs. I think growers should look at every aspect of their corn budget, seed costs, the diesel fuel costs, the insecticide, all of those need to be looked at. But the number one for corn is certainly fertilizer. So we're going to focus on that here today, is this fertilizer issue and how we might decrease that cost by using technology. So how is it that we can decrease either the use of the fertilizer or get more out of that fertilizer so we can increase yield? Well, I mentioned this a lot in grower meetings last year. It's roots. The only way forward here is we've got to focus entirely on developing better root systems under these crops, whether it's corn, soybeans, or cotton, whatever it is you're growing. It's roots. You've got to grow roots. And in the case of corn, most of that root mass evolves from these first 5 nodes that I show here in this picture in the middle of this screen here. Those first 5 nodal roots are critical. They form the root ball. The root ball under the corn plant is responsible for 80% of the root mass that sustains that plant. We have to get more function out of these roots. We got to be able to get nutrients to these roots better and more efficiently, so that every ounce of phosphorus, potassium, sulfur that we have in our soil, we utilize. Every ounce of fertilizer that we apply gets into this plant, so we can utilize fertilizers at efficiency levels that we have not been able to achieve previous to this. So it's going to come down to root. Now, there's lots of ways. Well, I say lots, there's really just six main ways to influence that early root mass. And remember, when are these roots growing? I hold up a plant here in my hands. You can see that these first 5 nodes are already developed on that small corn plant there. You have to do this right out of the box. The moment that thing germinates, it sets the crown. That's within 12 to 24 hours after the seed has been planted. It should be already setting that crown, and from there those roots are growing. So we need to do this right out of the box. That entails a number of practices like seeding depth. The many growers talk about how important it is to plant this seed at the right depth, and consider that certainly is the right hybrid that has that early vigor characteristics that we need. That helps set root mass. So there's the right environment, the right planting environment for corn. All of those are very important. But today I want to focus on, in this webinar, is this idea of utilizing fertilizer or technology in helping us expand or set these roots in this corn plant. So I'm been well known here in the southeastern United States as the starter guy. In other words, I've been a big proponent of utilizing starter fertilizer for the very purposes we just talked about. And as you can see in this slide pictures that I put together as a way of trying to convince growers of what I see in the field when I use starter and show them the path forward. Well, I show here a check plot, no starter fertilizer applied. That's off to my right as I face you in this picture here. Those 4 rows did not have any starter fertilizer. They don't look bad. I mean, lots of farmers plant corn that looks just like that. You can see that I've held this plant up that we dug up, showing the development of those first 5 nodal roots here. Certainly nothing that I would be ashamed of as far as the start to this corn plant. However, you take a look at this 4 rows and you realize quickly that something is very, very different here. the plants are much bigger. The root mass is 2-3 times greater than what we saw in the no starter plots. This is what I call the phosphorus cycle. It takes a little bit of phosphorus. Of course, nitrogen has to be there as well, but it's the key trigger is phosphorus. That phosphorus that's being taken up by those initial nodal roots triggers cell division. Cell division triggers growth. As long as you have the nitrogen resource available, it triggers growth. That growth triggers more root mass. That root mass finds more phosphorus. Phosphorus triggers more cell, and you get into this positive feedback loop. That's why these plants get so big. It's just not one thing that's happening here. It's a continual feedback loop as this plant grows roots, finds more nutrients, grows bigger, grows roots, finds more, grows bigger. That's the feedback loop we want to be in. And you can see that that's what creates this tremendous, this plant is not different in development. They're both growth stage V5 here. It's not different in any characteristics other than it's putting on more cells, more leaf length, leaf width, stalk length, root length, all of those triggered by this 1027-0. Now, I know in the Midwest, a lot of you guys don't apply extra phosphorus in the start. That's fine as long as you have the phosphorus resource in the soil that the nitrogen can help trigger this same response. We here in North Carolina often can use the chicken litter or waste that's been applied as a phosphorus source rather than starter. But you have to have that phosphorus and nitrogen combination. We just finished a study with John Deere looking at trying to figure out how to develop their latest, newer generation of planters, what nutrients are going to be important. It's this combination of nitrogen and phosphorus. And when everything works, as you saw in that field, in fact, this is the data from that field, you see this tremendous difference in yield. That's a 50 bushel difference here in this plot in 2020. Now, I wish I could say that starter fertilizer always results in these kind of significant differences, but that's not always the case for various reasons. Starter fertilizer is much more effective when we have cool, wet soils or where, like I just mentioned, phosphorus is not readily available from those. It's, again, the phosphorus trigger. In cool, wet soils, it's phosphorus that can't be taken up because it requires energy by the root system to move it across the membrane. Nitrogen's there, but it's not able to match with the phosphorus. Here's another good illustration of 40 bushel yield increases or greater from the use of a starter fertilizer, whether a 10-11-37 or a 10-27, which had that sulfur package that I often use with a starter fertilizer on sandy soils here in North Carolina. So again, these results are certainly possible, but are not the norm. Here's probably a little, now this is certainly early data, but this is probably closer to what we see oftentimes when we look at the influence of starter here. I'm using a 1-to-1 match of N and P here, and those cyan or red bars are matching with these two bars where we're not. The purple is no starter whatsoever. The green bar there, which is just potassium alone, and this just shows that what we're getting. We're getting anywhere from 10, 15. Maybe in some cases, like in Hyde County, again, a muck, wet, cool soil condition, 20 bushel yield. The average yield increase here, as it says down here, is 11.1. And that's, if I look over years and years of data that and you can see, we go clear back to 2004, looking at starter responses on soils in the Southeastern United States. This is about what I see. And I think this is probably very typical of what many of you see on average in starters. In other words, we could have those years where we get a tremendous, or those situations where we get a tremendous response to starter fertilizer. But if we average over the good years and the bad, the soils that have plenty of phosphorus, those that don't, well, I think this is a fairly good representation of our typical starter response. So this is the conclusions that I often come to when I talk about starter. Yields range from 6 to 58 bushels per acre in our trials. Over 51 site years, our average increase was a little over 10 bushels. Better yield on sandy soils compared to organic or clay loams. Planting done on wet has a very large, in other words, anything that restricts. Why is a sandy soil better yield response? We got less phosphorus there. We have to supply more phosphorus in those soils, whereas clay or muck soils hold some phosphorus, so we don't have that same phosphorus response. Starter should be applied, and as I said, to improve root growth. So this is a good summary of this important aspect of corn growth, enhancing roots, and the influence of starter in trying to achieve that. Now, what's the problem here then? Well, let me show you what the problem here then is as we look at the future. Here's a nice trial, again, sandy loam soil in the eastern county in North Carolina. Here's some different materials we applied as treatments in order to influence the early root growth. So I got a check. I've got a in-furrow 624-6 fertilizer. I got my typical application of 10-27-0 at this time at a 20 gallon per acre rate. I'm just like you. 10 gallon works at 40, 50 bushels. 20 ought to give me 100, shouldn't it? Obviously not true all the time or very rarely, but it's a more consistent rate for me. And I've got another fertilizer there, 620, I call it Black Label Zinc, that has some humic acids. And then I've got a growth regulator that's Radiate to try to enhance root growth. And I'm using a couple of biological products here. What you're seeing here is that two things. First of all, note my difference between the check and that 20 gallon rate there. That's about 12 bushels. Again, very close to what we see the long-term average. So keep that in mind. I'm getting about an average response here. You can also see that there's some other approaches here where I didn't use starter at all that seem interesting. At least they competed very clearly with the starter response and had some benefit over the check. In other words, technology, that's what we're looking for. Now, where's the problem here? I'm just going to focus on the starter. Here's the problem. 12 bushel increase, gross return. Now, I was figuring this back in December before prices of corn went up on the board, but I'm getting 67, 65 at 550 a bushel. The cost of that 20 gallon treatment at that time was $57.80. Today it's a little over $65 if in the latest that I priced for this same fertilizer here in early March. Regardless of whether you look at the December returns or the March returns, I'm barely breaking even here. That's what the cost of the fertilizer has done to us. It's taken something, 10, 12 bushels in the past. I can make money doing that, even in a year where I didn't get a really strong starter response. I'm at least enhancing my root growth. But now, with the increase in fertilizer, all of a sudden, this approach has some problems in returning enough money into the pocket to make the use of fertilizer, certainly at this rate, practical or affordable. So I've got to take some different approaches here. In other words, I've got to consider different ways that I can enhance this root growth while cutting back on my starter or eliminating it if I can. And so how can we do that? What can we do? We need that root growth. We need that what it contributes to yield. Yield's still king. How can we cut back on utilizing our typical fertilizer approach in the future? We're going to have to do. I don't believe for 1 second that in 2023 that cost of that fertilizer is going to be any cheaper than it is today. I don't believe that for a second. So we got to take this is what we're in a new future. We've got to take new steps to do this. So there's four things that I have tested over the years that I think have some validity in either enhancing the role of, in other words, let me utilize starter and get that 40, 30, 40 bushel increase that I need, or that can be used to replace some of the starter in that mix. In other words, use less fertilizer and some of this material to drive that uptake, root system development, phosphorus uptake, and yield. So those four things, and some of these you guys are well familiar with, humic or fulvic acids. They work best, in my opinion, and we tested a new one. You could see I just showed some data on some. They work best when you add them to a fertilizer, and they're about worth a 4, maybe an 8 bushel bump in the right conditions. They're not consistent, but they do have some utility in certain situations. Biologicals, these are probably the new kid on the block, is these bacterial endomycorrhiza or vascular mycorrhizal materials that are touted as being biologicals. Part of the problem with the biologicals today is that you can do about anything and say it's a biological. We're doing a lot of in-lab testing here these days, and a lot of materials just don't have any live biology or even sufficient numbers of dead bacteria that would make it work. So we're a little concerned about how these products are coming, but I think there are some good biologicals. You saw a couple products there that we tested. I think there is going to be some path forward here, but at this date, they're sort of inconsistent as well. Growth regulators, the products I showed, that Radiate product from Nutrien is a growth regulator for roots. Again, it's a product that's just coming on into its own. I think it's probably more consistent than some of these others that I've just mentioned. But again, it's going to require us to look at these. And again, it's a chemical treatment. And then we have charged molecules. And that's where I really want to focus our attention here today, because unlike some of these others, the biologicals, the growth regulators, we have a history with understanding charged particles, particularly at molecules. And what you remember, I'm classifying charged molecules as things like Avail, Nutrisphere, and the new products that we see on the market today, NutriCharge, which is some of the work that we've been doing with NutriCharge gives me a really strong indication that these charged molecules have come into their own. With this next generation of materials here is really showing consistent and strong results. And I think these have a real role to play in our future in reducing or utilizing fertilizer in a very different way. Yeah, just to step back as we talk about these charged molecules a little bit. This is some data that we had of the old Avail materials out there. And you can see again, no starter versus a 12-12-4. And then the dark blue bar is the 12-12-4 with the Avail. And you can see we were enhancing that starter effect and leading to a better yield response. So our average yield increase from starter was 6 bushels. With the additive, we jumped that to 12 bushels in this case. So here was a good illustration of what I just talked. 6 bushel, I can't afford the fertilizer for 6 bushels. But at 12, now I'm getting the kind of response that I need, and again, growing better roots. I'm not going to show the data, but we had lots of data that showed that we increased root mass, the depth of root balls, and many other including the stalk diameter, which is an indication of better root development in early corn. So we have lots of data on these early generation products such as Avail that showed they did have some utility in improving the response to starter fertilizer. Let's just, I showed this, I think, a year ago. This is probably the most striking evidence of what we're seeing from these next generation charged molecules like NutriCharge. So here's no starter. So here's a no starter plot here, just as I showed in an earlier picture here. Again, corn looks fairly healthy. I wouldn't turn this corn down. Here's 20 gallons of that 1027 in the 2x2 band, and you clearly see as I step back and forth here the difference. Yeah, it's gotten bigger. And you can even see the nitrogen impact. This is yellow, has yellowing here. Here's darker green. We're picking up nitrogen. This is the effect that is in, this is that root effect that I'm mentioning. So clearly got an impact here. Then here's a veil. Now, veil looks very similar to this is a 6 gallon per acre rate. So it's not as much starter. We've now added the veil to this to enhance that starter role. It doesn't look quite as good, I have to admit, as the 20 gallons. That's not going to cost me nearly as much, 20 gallons, but it looks much better than the starter or the no starter treatment. And then here's probably the outstanding treatment of them all. Put 6 gallons with NutriCharge, and now look at this corn. It looks better than 20 gallons of fertilizer at a lower rate with this next generation technology here. So this is what's exciting. This is why I think the time has come for us to move in to these new technologies, because we can't afford 20 gallons of starter. We got used to having that cheap fertilizer. And yeah, I know a lot about fertilizer. I'm confident in fertilizer. So it was easy just to say, I'll just use more fertilizer. Those days are over. So here's a comparison of the yield between these treatments here. You see the 20 gallons of 1027.0. Yeah, I made 20 bushel. That was a good plot there. But take a look at what we did, where I made over 30 bushel with just 6 gallons. That should be 1027.0 there. I see I got a typo already. And NutriCharge. This is what we're after here. This is the future, and why we're talking about this even here today and trying to show some things. Here's tissue concentrations. Like I said, the issue here is trying to enhance root development. How do we do that? We've got enhanced phosphorus uptake. If you're going to get cell division, phosphorus tissue concentration should be higher. So here's a 2016 study where we're looking at corn tissue concentrations at R1, and we have, again, just the starter fertilizer at low or higher rate, and we've got similar tissue concentrations at 10 gallons using the NutriCharge as we got with 20 gallons just with the night fertilizer alone. So again, well, and you can see the problem with fertilizer, adding more doesn't always result in a response. So that would make this very difficult to talk about add more fertilizer to make up phosphorus uptake, because you can see I didn't get any increase in phosphorus uptake at all. And that's because oftentimes we increase fertilizer, we create antagonisms with other nutrients such as zinc or magnesium, and that causes us to not get that yield response. And then here's the yield difference between these treatments. And again, you can see the 13 bushel yield there for the two fertilizer treatment, 10 gallons and 20 gallons, no real difference there. But again, our biggest difference is when we use the NutriCharge, we got a significant 20 bushel gain here with our starter treatments. How about in nitrogen long term, how this plays out? And I think this is an illustration of when you get these root systems started, you change the nature of the whole yield. I've said this to growers in North Carolina here all this year. I said, get this crop started. It's no coincidence that North Carolina had the best start to a corn crop we've ever had in 2021, and we made record yields. That's exactly the correlation. You get a crop started, you increase its root mass, you lead to ability to tolerate stress and lead to better consistency and yields. And so here's a good illustration of this, how much that early start changes your crop through the season. So there's a check, the 1027 at 5 gallons per acre, that's a low rate. I got some differences there, but look what happens when I put that charged molecule, the NutriCharge, with that to enhance phosphorus. This again is this phosphorus uptake difference. Yeah, here's Nitrogen uptake is looking at some 2019 data. You can see how consistent this data is. We're looking at 2019 data. We're looking at nitrogen uptake by V10, and again, reflecting the increase in root mass here at this low rate of a starter solution. Here's the phosphorus in that same test there. Looking at phosphorus uptake and at V10, and you can see the tremendous difference in phosphorus grams per plant is what that it represents there. And I think I've got yield. Yes, indeed, I've got, here's the 2012 yield. Certainly, this is a problem with just 5 gallons of 1027.0. This is why I use more, is I can't get a consistent yield response from just 5 gallons. I'm not picking up enough phosphorus to start that cycle. So here I just got a 3 bushel difference, whereas if I add the NutriCharge, now all of a sudden I got a 15 bushel difference. So again, this is reflective of what is our problem. I can't afford 5 gallons at 3 bushels, but I can afford 15 bushel differences with that 5 gallons and some NutriCharge here. And just to wrap up some of the data that we collected, this was a really great study here in 2021 showing some of these differences at very, very low rates of early fertilizer. We had a 1-to-1 blend of 17-17-0, 1 part nitrogen, 1 part phosphorus, 5 gallons and 2 gallons. And you can see this is plant biomass. So we're looking at differences in how much biomass this plant. So again, a reflection of this early growth. And you can see here that the Nutrisphere is enhancing that biomass of those plants. So get more roots, more above ground biomass. And certainly if I fertilizer, I drive that even harder. And you can see how much the more, that's the beauty of NutriCharge. That's what I like about this approach with this type of charged molecule, is that whatever nutrients I have there, whether it's from litter or from swine effluent or from fertilizer, the more nutrients I have, the better efficiency I get out of those nutrients. Unlike in a typical field situation with more nutrients, typically all you get is just about the same uptake. You're not, in fact, your efficiency is going down in most cases. Here, my efficiency is going up as I apply more nutrients, and that's because I'm able to get them into the plant using this technology. Here's phosphorus. Again, you see the tremendous differences we're getting in phosphorus, almost matching with this lower rate of fertilizer, how much phosphorus we're taking up in this high 1027.0 at 20 gallons. That's just amazing how much impact that's having on phosphorus uptake here. And if we then go to the real tail here, you can see that indeed we're increasing yield significantly in this crop. I'm getting at 2 gallons per acre, I'm getting 11 bushel increase in yield at that very, very low application rate. I think this is the kind of evidence, this consistency of the product and the consistency of this response that leads me to think that this kind of technology is what we should be focused on going forward as we struggle against fertilizer prices, the lack of fertilizers I think we're going to see in the future, driven by issues around climate change and all of these things. We're going to have to get more efficiency out of what we use here. And you can talk about corn, of course, but even soybeans. Typically, you don't think about a starter fertilizer on soybeans, but this past season we did some experimentation with looking at the starter fertilizers on soybeans. Look at that 318-18 at 5 gallons. I'm getting about a 7 bushel per acre increase here in that with that fertilizer. So that's, 15, 16, or I've heard somebody say that they thought we could see $17 soybeans. That's the kind of increase I'd like to see here. So just wrapping up what we've talked here about today, our issue here is how can we utilize our nutrients more effectively and efficiently, particularly now that fertilizer prices and availability are at stake for us, that we've got to get more out of what we have in our soil and out of our fertilizer that we apply. So these studies, as it says there, indicate that these charged molecules have a capacity to help us improve fertilizer phosphorus availability. And that's what if you look at their mode of action, that's what they're talking about. They're protecting the phosphorus that's being applied in the soil. They're helping that maintain that interaction between the phosphorus and the root surface, and therefore driving that reaction or that positive feedback loop that I talked about. So indeed, charged fertilizer can indeed be applied at lower rates with similar or even better results sometimes than just using a high rate of starter alone. Finally, just some conclusions. Starter continue will be one of our most important tools. We have to get root mass. There's no way around that. However we can do that, we have to achieve that, or we're going to cut yield. And again, yield is it. That's our only tool for making sure we can afford to grow crops. Starter fertilizer is important. Phosphorus uptake is the key, whether you already have it in the soil and you can apply a NutriCharge with a nitrogen fertilizer and improve starter and improve that nitrogen phosphorus response there, or whether we're applying it as a part of the starter itself. I think NutriCharge has a tremendous opportunity to help us improve nutrient uptake early in that crop growth and starting that cycle. So indeed, they like the source uptake, placement rate, and placement, and all of these things are critical in how we do this. All right, I think that's all I've got. I'll be happy to take some questions here if they've got some questions.
Got one question on here. What's better in furrow, fulvic acid or humic acid?
Fulvic acid actually is a better in furrow as far as getting quick uptake. Fulvics have a lot higher charge density than humics, and therefore are much better at facilitating the nutrient root interaction, the chelating action that fulvics or humics have is much higher in a fulvic acid. So I like fulvics in starter. The only reason you'd use a humic is in a real sandy soil. There, basically, you're trying to help by adding a humic. You're trying to help drive biology. In other words, the growth of your microbes in the soil will be enhanced by a humic there.
We've got another question from Karen, which I'll answer here. It asks whether NutriCharge can be applied to nitrogen as well, or just the phosphorus component. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I tried to explain that toward the end there. I did a poor job of it, but yes, no, it could be applied. I focused on phosphorus because of the importance of phosphorus, but it can be applied to nitrogen there, which will then, as the nitrogen drives, in other words, you're utilizing your phosphorus in the soil. It can also protect that nitrogen and enhance that nitrogen uptake efficiency. And at the same time, as that phosphorus becomes available in the soil, that extends that protection to your phosphorus molecules that are being released by the soil and help them drive into the root. So indeed, it can be applied to nitrogen and have similar, if not just as good impact as it would with a starter that has phosphorus fertilizer.
And what it does in that situation, just from a mode of action standpoint, is it works as a negatively charged molecule and it works with positively charged nutrients. So the nitrogen, it's able to hold on to ammonium and delay the conversion in the soil. And obviously ammonium is a form of nitrogen that doesn't require conversion by the plant. Another question here, two-part question. On sandy loam soil, how much nitrogen can you put in a 3x2x2? And will a P-based starter boost yield more than it was just a straight 24% with sulfur?
Yeah, those are great questions. The first question there, how much nitrogen can I add? I typically would like to stop around 50 units, 50 pounds of nitrogen in a 3x2x2. I think the data from Tony Venn, now most of his data was actually not on, it was on silt loam, but it's certainly he even on silt loam saw as you got much over 50 to 70 pounds of nitrogen, start to see an impact on emergence on corn. So in a sandy soil, I'd like to stop around 50 units of nitrogen. Let's see. The next part of that question was, now I'm showing my Joe Biden moment. I forgot what the next part of the question was. Read that again.
What is that? Will a P-based starter boost yield more than it was just a straight 24% nitrogen sulfur?
That, again, a great question. The answer to that question depends on your soil test, actually. What I typically recommend growers do if they've got very high to very high amount of phosphorus in their soil, they don't need the P. They don't need the P. It's only when you're average or below average that phosphorus component of that starter becomes a more important component. You're gonna use nitrogen as a starter to drive the start to get that P taking that you already have out of the soil. So no, you don't need P at high or very high phosphorus concentrations in the soil. You can drop that component.
Okay. This next question I can answer. So a typical rate and application of NutriCharge and cost per acre. So NutriCharge rate on phosphorus, recommended application rate is 0.5% volume to volume in the fertilizer solution, up to a 15 gallon an acre application rate. Above 15 gallons an acre, it drops down to 0.25%. What that means in terms of cost for the grower, at 2.5 gallons of starter, it costs the grower $2.25 an acre. Obviously at 5 gallons, $4.50. And then a 20 gallon rate at that high volume rate runs about $9 an acre. So it's always cheaper to add NutriCharge to your starters than it is to add additional phosphorus fertilizer with that efficiency. Another question we have here. Have you tried seaweed extracts in furrow?
I have not. We experimented with some seaweed extracts in a greenhouse study, but we haven't done a in-furrow in-field application with seaweed extracts. The initial impact in the greenhouse stage tended to indicate that indeed it would reduce some salt effects. But again, I'd be reluctant until we have a good trial in the field to really see how much impact that can extend to a typical agricultural soil.
Caleb had a question. He says, if you're banding phosphorus 4 inches below the seed with a dry fertilizer and a strip till system, can we add NutriCharge to it? And do we need a P-based starter? So I can answer the first part of that question. Okay. You can absolutely apply NutriCharge to it. In fact, we've just released, from a handling perspective, it's always difficult treating dry fertilizers with liquids. So we've taken NutriCharge itself and created a dry version of the product that will allow your dealer to be able to apply it much easier to fertilizer. And with that, we've been able to add some of the nitrogen benefits into it as well. So yes, you can apply NutriCharge or a dry product, which is ionized to it. And then second part of the question for you, Ron, is do they need a P-based starter if you're tilling?
If they're banding beneath the seed, my answer to that is yes. What we typically, and we did this with some John Deere, looking at depth of placement of phosphorus and starter here with some John Deere equipment this past year. And actually what we found was it was just as effective placed deeper. Now, what I think happens is you get some movement of water upwards and it moves that material up a little bit as it comes up that strip till. But we did not. If the answer to that is yes, it could be just as effective placed underneath the seed.
Okay, another question here. I think this last question. Rose asked, "How does Nutritron work on long-term crops?" My response to that question is that NutriCharge doesn't matter what form of phosphate you're adding. It just matters that you're adding phosphate to the soil. So as long as that crop requires phosphate, it will change the equilibrium of how phosphorus responds in the soil. And one of the best explanations or examples of this was looking at, we just took crops out of the equation entirely last year at BYU Idaho and did a test of how APP responds in a very calcareous soil. And what they're able to demonstrate is that phosphorus treated with NutriCharge in that soil has more than double the amount of phosphorus, soluble phosphorus available to the plant over a long period of time. And so we can typically show that increase in available phosphorus over a 6-month period. So for long-term crops, it does really provide a nice steady supply of freely available phosphorus to that crop. So it doesn't matter if you're growing, field crops to then obviously going into a permanent crop situation. If phosphorus is needed by the crop, then NutriCharge can provide a benefit. So I think that was all the questions. So I just, again, really like to thank you, Ron, for your work and your continued work with us and evaluating the use for these products. What we'll do is we'll make this video available and we'll be able to send it out to everybody so that you can look at it. I'll also include Ron's email and you can reach out to him directly on any of his studies that he's done in the past. But really like to thank everybody for their time. Thank you, Ron.
You bet. Thanks.